G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to the first session in the life of Messiah from a Messianic Jewish perspective. I know that this series will really bless you, and I thank you for coming along. First session of the life of Messiah from a Messianic Jewish perspective. It's a mouthful. As we said in the prayer time, this has been produced, this has been researched, this has been compiled and authored by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the head of RL Ministries, and it took him over 40 years to do this. And it's a brilliant course. It really is a brilliant course. So let's get stuck into it. All right. Let's go. Introduction. Here we go. This is the explanation slide. I'll show you a couple of things here. First up, we're going to have the major divisions, which we see there. First major division is the introduction of the king. What else is there? We see the subdivisions, which we're going to see as we go through the slides. We're going to see also a paragraph number. That paragraph number coincides with the harmony of the Gospels. This course is based upon a harmony of the Gospels, and this is the Ariel's Harmony of the Gospels, which is based upon A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels, bit of a plug there for it. So we will see it has paragraph numbers inside. It doesn't go on page numbers, it goes on paragraph numbers. You can see right there, there's a paragraph number. I think you can see that. Just for your information, the Harmony has all wherever the Gospel writers are writing about the same thing, that they're all written in parallel, so we can see what each one is saying about that situation. If you can see that, there it is. Okay. Now, what else is there? We have those numbers you might see up in the tops of the slides. They're actually manuscripts that RL Ministries have. It's a manuscript on that particular topic. So what else is there? Okay, let's go. Now, almost all courses in the life of Messiah will give you an introduction of the course by giving you the Greek background of the first century and preceding centuries. However, guess what? Jesus was not a Greek. He was a Jew, and he presented himself to Israel from a Hebrew background, not a Greek background. And it's absolutely sure. I mean, Greek influence on the period was great because, I mean, you know, and it does need to be studied. But when we're introducing the Gospels and Jesus' presentation of the kingdom, it's Hebrew background that needs to be studied, not Greek. And generally speaking, today, most of your Bible colleges and most of your theological colleges and schools present the New Testament from a Greek or a Roman background. But that's fine. You know, when you're looking at books like the second half of the book of Acts or Galatians or Colossians or 1st, 2nd Corinthians, because much of those books are from a Greek or a Roman background. But when we look to the Gospels are a Jewish background, and specifically it's a 1st century Jewish background. And that's where the life of Jesus is played out in 1st century Israel. So we need to look at that. So what happens is that there are a lot of things which are said and events happen the way they happen, and things are written the way they're written because of the specific Jewish frame of reference. So many of the situations and many of the statements and the issues presented in these Gospels, the New Testament, were very commonplace in Jesus's day. But hello, we're in 21st century Australia. And most of that Jewish frame of reference is lost. In fact, from around the 4th century, the majority Gentile church began to ignore this. And so you have things which were very knowledgeable to the Jewish mind. You have statements, for instance, like born of water. That's a very specific Jewish terminology. And they knew what it meant in that day. But today, you know, we've had church splits over that. Why? Because they've lost a Jewish frame of reference. If they'd asked a Jew what it meant, he could have told him. But instead they have church splits. So one cannot understand the Gospels properly without understanding the Jewish background, the Jewish frame of reference, which is what this study is all about. So when the gospel writers wrote their gospels, it was all done from a first century Jewish background. And they didn't have to explain to their readers what was meant because they all understood it. But this study will assist us in understanding the first century Jewish background. Another author, Alfred Edersheim, he wrote The Life and Times of Jesus. And that he tried to capture the same thing. But, not many people read that book anymore. But so now we have produced this, and pray God that this would bless you immensely as it has me. Now, what's the method that we're going to look at here? There are two ways that we can have approaching the study of the Gospels. The most common method that is used today is the geographic method, where Jesus's ministry is looked at in the light of his early Galilean ministry, or his middle Judean ministry, his middle Galilean ministry, his Perean ministry, and his later Galilean ministry. So it's a geographic approach. So it just depends where he was as to how they approach it. This is the most common method of studying the life of Jesus. But there's one major drawback to this, and that is it fails to show the correlation between events. So in this method, you will see he does a miracle or he does a healing, but we don't see any correlation made between what he's just done and the following event or teaching. But there's a second method, and that's what we'll be using. And we'll be using the thematic approach. And the main benefit of this approach is that you can see the correlation between one event and the other, one teaching and the other, between a teaching and an event, and vice versa. And this way, we get a better picture of what's going on. So the outline we have before us is the thematic approach. And if you take this outline, we divide Jesus's life and ministry into 12 major divisions. The basic theme that we will develop is Jesus as the Messianic King. Yeshua, Messianic King. Yeshua is Jesus's Hebrew name. So sometimes you'll see Yeshua there, other times Jesus. Same person. So the first major division is the introduction, or the coming of the King. And this deals with his birth and infancy, his baptism, his temptation. The second division is the authentication of the King. And here he announces his messianic claims, authenticating them with miracles, signs, and wonders. And during this period, he receives a lot of opposition from the Pharisees. Section 3 is the controversy over the king, and here we have the leadership rejecting his messianic claims, and largely due to his repudiation of Pharisaic Judaism. These are terms we're going to go through as we head through the study here. So we see here a radical change in his ministry. The fourth division is the training of the 12 by the king. So as a result of his rejection by the leadership, we now have the training of the 12 for their new mission performed later on in the book of Acts. Then we have the opposition to the king. First up, the opposition came from the leaders, the Jewish leadership of the day. Now it comes from the common people. They reject his messiahship and the authenticating signs. Then we have the preparation of the disciples by the king. And this now covers the final period of his public ministry. And special focus here is on preparing the disciples for his coming death and their future ministry. And in section 7, or division 7, we have the official presentation of the king. And this is where he enters Jerusalem riding upon a donkey. And here he closes his public ministry. He has his final conflict with the Pharisees, and he lays down the precondition for his return and setting up the kingdom. And then in division 8, we now have the preparation for the death of the king. And in the Olivet Discourse, he spells out his prophecies of destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and about his second coming. And then he goes on to his last Passover and his agony of Gethsemane. Section 9, division 9, we have the trial of the king, and here the rejection of the Messiah is carried out. In division 10, we have the death of the king, and the events here surrounding the death of the Messiah are detailed in chronological sequence. Section 11, division 11, is the resurrection and the ascension of the king. And this marks the period of the final training of the apostles and the ascension of Messiah to heaven. And then the section 12 is a sequel. Well, the sequel, what's the sequel about? Well, the remainder of the New Testament records occurrences in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the surrounding Gentile world. These are in the decades after Jesus' ascension. And this sequel section, this concluding section, will look at the New Testament development of several issues that originated from the Gospels. So we'll be following this 12-point division of the thematic approach of his kingship. As we go along, I am certain that you will see the advantage of this thematic approach versus the geographical approach of his life. It's a brilliant study. Okay, so here we're looking at paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. Now, there are critics who say the Gospels contradict each other. But you know what? In actual fact, as we go through this, we're going to see that the Gospels are not actually contradictory. They're actually supplemental. And I'm going to show you why. In Luke's prologue, in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, what we're going to look at here is you just imagine if we think in terms of a circle, and in that circle is everything that Jesus ever said or did, right? And so everything he said, everything he did, and all his actions are in that circle. So Jesus' entire life is within the circle. And in fact, you know, the Gospels only record 75 to 80 days of Jesus' life. That's all we have. So it's all in this circle. Now in John's Gospel, John 21, verse 25, it's said that everything that Jesus did is not written in this book because the world would not be able to contain all that would be written. So each of the gospel writers would have to be selective in everything they chose to write in their gospel because there's so much. So he would choose what to record and what not to record. But what would be the basis of what they would pull out of the circle and record or not record? The basis was on their particular theme. So as to what they chose or what not to use. Each of them have a theme. Each gospel writer had a theme as to what he wanted to develop. Now, so Matthew had a particular theme. He wanted to develop, and so he looks inside the circle and he picks out point A. And this is going to help him to develop his theme. So Matthew uses it. He says, I want that for my gospel. And then he looks at point B, but this point doesn't help him with his theme, so he skips it. He then looks at point C and decides to use this point. So this helps to develop his theme. Now, so we have Matthew, he pulls out of there point A and point C, not interested in point B. And then Mark comes along. He comes along with his theme for his book, and he looks at point A, and it is not beneficial to put it in for his theme. He says, no, I don't need that. So where this was helpful for Matthew, it's not helpful for Mark. Then we get a point B, which was of no benefit to Matthew, but it's beneficial to Mark and to his theme. So he pulls it out, and he uses it in his gospel. Then we look at point C, and This was beneficial to, this was beneficial to Matthew, but it's not beneficial, but it's also beneficial to Mark as well. So he takes point C as well. And now what we see is that Matthew and Mark may actually use the same point, but remember, they have a different theme. What's going to be different is their theme and the way that they use this point and write about it. Each of them will be a little bit different from each other because they're looking at that point from the perspective of their individual theme. Therefore, the Gospels are in fact complementary to each other, not contradictory. Right, here we go. Now, Matthew. What's Matthew's theme? Matthew's theme is Jesus, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Matthew may have been the first gospel written because of the need, and it was written possibly as early as AD 50, probably before AD 70. And remember, AD 70 is when the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed. Now, most people hold to Mark or Luke being the first gospel written, but we're going to see that there is another reason why they may not have been written first. Matthew, remember, well, we'll find out that he was formerly a tax collector for the Roman government. He writes to the Jews. In Acts 7, at the stoning of Stephen, the Jewish believers were dispersed from Jerusalem, but the apostles, they remained in Jerusalem. But now the problem was that they were no longer available to those in the dispersion in places like Damascus or Antioch, because at the stoning of Stephen, the Jewish believers scattered out of Jerusalem, but the apostles remained there. So what happens? So when they had questions and needed an authoritative word on what Jesus said or did, the apostles were not present where they lived. So Matthew then, writing to the Jews, he set down the first narrative of the life of Messiah for the sake of the Messianic Jews who had been dispersed or scattered. Why? To give them an authoritative account of what Jesus said or did. So Matthew makes heavy use of the prophecies of Messiah's first coming to show that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, is the fulfillment of all those messianic prophecies. And his purpose is to show that this Jesus, this Yeshua, was the messianic Jewish Davidic king. Now, this raises a question today in the mind of the Jew as well as the Jews of the first century. And their question is this: if he is the Messiah, then where is the kingdom and the peace that the Messiah was to inaugurate? What happened to it if he was the Messiah? So in Matthew's gospel, he now has to explain that even though Jesus was this messianic king, why the kingdom was not set up when he was here before. So you see Matthew spending much more time than any of the other gospel writers on the messianic kingdom to answer those questions. And he will show why the messianic kingdom was not set up in chapters 12 and 13 of his gospel, and that this one is still that messianic king. So Matthew writes with impending judgment on Israel. There was another man who wrote that as well, Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote of the impending Babylonian judgment. But Matthew writes with the impending judgment of AD 70 with the Romans. And because the Messiah was rejected and the unpardonable sin was committed, Jerusalem was now under judgment of coming destruction, and the Jewish believers will have to respond in a specific way when that destruction comes. Now, I know that I just said unpardonable sin there. We're going to be covering all of this as we go through. Now, and you'll see terms there which you'll say, what's he talking about? We'll cover it as we go through. So Matthew's gospel is written to deal with that issue which uniquely concerned the Jewish nation. And Matthew quotes the Old Testament or the Tanakh, the 5 books of Moses. He quotes the prophets and he quotes the writings over 60 times, and he makes extensive use of messianic prophecies to show that Jesus was really the messianic Davidic king. So that's Matthew. Now, Mark's theme is Jesus the Messiah, the servant of Jehovah. Whereas Matthew writes his gospel for the Jews, Mark writes his gospel for the Romans. And their main interest is in the culture of their day within the context of the Roman Empire. So it was more about action than teaching. Romans were more concerned about a man's ability than his lineage. Roman society was very much achievement oriented. So Mark is more interested in recording the actions, the doings, and the deeds of the Messiah rather than what the Messiah taught. And so he presents the Messiah as a man of action. For the ideal Roman, he receives a commission, he carries it out, and he comes back as quickly as possible, reporting the mission accomplished. Yes, centurion, mission done. So what we see here is that Mark pictures the Messiah as one who receives a commission and he's now anxious to carry it out. So in Mark, what do we see? We see a rapidity of action, a sense of urgency, a sense of immediacy, a sense of getting the job done. And you know, when you read Mark's gospel, you know, you'll see the words like immediately, straight away, forthwith. Over 40 times, Mark used this word outhos. In our English translation, it's translated into those three different ways: straight away, immediately, or forthwith. So Mark is into rapidity, mate. Let's get the job done. A sense of, he writes about a sense of rapid action. There's a mission to be carried out, a job to be completed. Let's get it done. Now, even though Mark is writing to a Roman audience, he does not forget his Jewish frame of reference. So Mark falls back to the prophecies of Isaiah, to the servant of Jehovah. Isaiah's favorite title for the Messiah was the servant of Jehovah. And Mark uses that title to show how Jesus fulfills those passages. Messiah was a servant of the Most High, and he went straight away, immediately, forthwith, carried out the commission. That's Jesus. Luke comes along. What's his theme? His theme is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of Man. Now, Luke, we know he was a physician. He was a first trained medical missionary. He may have been from Antioch. Theophilus, to whom he addressed his gospel, was a wealthy government official in Antioch. And Luke will emphasize the humanity of Jesus, the humanity of the Messiah. Matthew wrote to the Jews, Mark to the Romans, and now Luke, he writes to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks had two major areas of interest, and the first major area had to do with the ideal man, both physically and mentally. And so we have the Greek philosophies, for example, that showed an acuteness of thinking. And the ideal man to the Greek was someone who was self-disciplined in both mind and body. One who is able to control his thoughts, a deep thinker. So they innovated, for example, the Olympic Games and the, I think it's Isthmian Games, which was able to show mastery of those who were able to exercise this discipline in body. And so Jesus, in Luke's gospel, is now presented as one who is very self-disciplined. And then, so that's the ideal man, self-disciplined. The second major area to the Greek is that of historical accuracy. And in fact, many of our earliest histories come from Greek historical records. And it is this second area of historical accuracy that tells us why Luke chose to write. For example, Matthew, Mark, and John were all eyewitnesses to a greater or lesser degree to Messiah's life. Luke was not an eyewitness. In fact, he became a believer through Paul's ministry, and the whole life of Messiah had already played itself out. Messiah had already ascended into heaven. And in verse 1 of Luke 1, excuse me, you will see, for as much as many have taken in hand to draw up a narrative concerning these matters which have been fulfilled among us, verse 2, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses. So notice what Luke admits. He admits that by the time he writes his gospel, there were already narratives available. And in fact, some of these narratives were written by people who were actually eyewitnesses, Matthew and Mark, for example. And the fact that you already had gospels out there written by eyewitnesses, why does Luke then feel the need to write another gospel of his own in which he was not an eyewitness? Forget chapter 1, verse 3 of Luke. He tells us why. Verse 3 says, it seemed good to me also, having traced the course of all things accurately from the first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus. So the Greek word for order here is chronological order, and that tells us his special concern. So in order to communicate the life of Messiah in a way that the Greek could understand, remember, for them, there had to be accuracy with the verification of a claim. No fake news there. It had to be accurate, right? Matthew, Mark, and John were not interested in recording the events in chronological order, but they were more interested in recording the events to show their theme. So if we were to look back at the circle of Messiah's activities, Matthew, he recorded events A and C, but in reality, event C actually precedes event A. But Luke is concerned with chronology. And as we go through the other Gospels, we'll find the order is different. When there is a difference in order between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, which gospel would we go to for the order? We always go to Luke's gospel, because Luke, he alone made the claim that he wrote it in order, in chronological order. So, for instance, when we go to the temptation, Matthew and Luke's orders are different. So which order did it actually happen in? It happened in Luke's order. Why? Because Luke made the claim that he writes his gospel in chronological order. So even though Luke was not an eyewitness, which he said himself, he interviewed eyewitnesses such as Mary. Why? Because he tells us in his gospel what she was thinking. Mary kept all these things in her heart, he says in chapter 2, verse 19. How would Luke know unless he talked to her? Remember when Paul was in prison? Luke was in Jerusalem for 2 years. So he had time to interview Mary and other eyewitnesses. All right. One more thing about Luke. He has 3 special areas of concern. First up, Jerusalem. So Luke will tell us what Jesus did and said in this city, and he taught things about Jerusalem that other gospel writers left out completely. He has a special focus on Jerusalem. Another focus of Luke's is Gentiles. So he recorded details of Jesus's ministry among them and his teachings and sayings about them that the other gospel writers left out. Remember that Luke also spent much of his time with Paul the apostle to the Gentiles. He was traveling and evangelizing with him. So Luke would share Paul's special concern for Gentiles. Third area where he has a special concern is for women. He will talk about the ministries women had with, to, or from the Messiah that other writers left out. For example, how was the ministry of Jesus financed? Well, Luke tells us in Luke 8, verse 3, by wealthy women. So Luke will largely give the accounts of Mary and Martha, for instance. So Luke will tell us more about the role of women who ministered to Jesus or who he ministered to. And he records more of the teachings to them or about them than any of the other gospel writers. And Luke will also present the humanity of Jesus by recording the fact that he got hungry, he got thirsty, he got tired. All humans do. And so Luke is the only one who records these things. However, this one was the God-man, so he was perfect in all his dealings with man. Okay, so we've done 3. John. What's John's theme? John's theme is Yeshua the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, is the Son of God. Now, John, remember, was one of Jesus's closest associates, and he was a cousin of Jesus. You might know that, but he was a cousin of Jesus. And so John shows us the deity of Jesus. Luke showed us the humanity of Jesus. Luke would record more of Jesus being hungry, thirsty, tired, and sleepy. That's his humanity. But guess what? God never gets hungry, thirsty. He doesn't get tired or sleepy. In fact, Psalm 121 verse 4 says, and he that keepeth Israel never slumbers or sleeps. God does not get tired. He's always awake. Now, while Luke shows that Jesus was fully human, John shows that Jesus is fully divine. When John writes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already had wide circulation and were written to specific audiences, Jews for Matthew, Romans for Mark, Greeks for Luke. John, he now writes to the church at large and to unbelievers. Why? So that they could be convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. That's what he says in John 20, verses 30 and 31. So one of his concerns was to write about those things that the other gospel writers left out. In fact, a large part, around 90% of John's material is material brand new, not previously recorded. So while Mark was interested in what Jesus did, John was interested in what Jesus said and taught. So John's primary concern is what Jesus said and what he taught, not what he did. So in John's gospel, we have sermons and discourses more than any of the other gospels. The main theme for John's gospel is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. But he also carries through his book 2 sub-themes, and he weaves them, he intertwines them in his gospel. The first sub-theme is the conflict of light and darkness. And we see this in John's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. He uses statements like light and darkness, day and night, which, if you just read it today, yeah, big deal. On the surface, it seems unimportant, except when you understand John's sub-themes. For example, after Jesus reveals Judas as the betrayer at the last Passover, John writes, he says, Judas went out, and John adds, and it was night. Now, it was obviously night because a Passover meal is never celebrated at daytime. It had to be night. But so why did John write, and it was night? Because the Passover is always eaten after sunset and before midnight. looking at that, you'd think, well, that was totally irrelevant. So what? Except when you understand it is part of his sub-theme of the conflict of light and darkness. It's obvious that it was night, but what's John saying? John is actually saying more. He's saying that Judas was of the night and of the darkness, because the deed he was about to do was not a deed of the light or of the day. So what he's saying is that Judas was of the night. He was of the darkness. Second sub-theme in John's gospel is that the Son, Jesus, came to reveal to men the Father. He came to reveal to men the Father in heaven. So Jesus' purpose in John's sub-theme was to be the Father's revealer. And this also explains why John spends so much time on what Jesus said and taught. So through all these discourses, he's revealing the nature of the Father to men. Now, one additional thing about John's gospel, John likes to work around the number 7, the figure 7. John has 3 sets of 7s. He has 7 signs, for instance. He has, water into wine. He had the nobleman's son. He had the healing of a paralytic. He had the feeding of 5,000. He had the walking in water. He had the man born blind. He had the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, just the 7 signs. He had 7 discourses. He had the new birth, healing on the Sabbath. He had the bread of life. He had the water of life. He had the discourse on light, the good shepherd, the upper room discourse. So there are his 7 there. But he also has 7 I am statements. He said, I am the bread, I am light, I am the door, I am the shepherd, I am the resurrection, I am the way, I am the vine. So John has this, he works around the number 7. He has 7 of these things. Okay, so what we've seen is we've seen all 4 gospel writers. Each of them has a theme. Each of them are writing to a different audience. We have Matthew to the Jews. Jesus is the Messianic King. We have Mark to the Romans. He's the perfect servant. We have Luke to the Greeks. He's the ideal man in his humanity. We have John writing to the church at large that Jesus is the Son of God. He is God. Okay. We're going to look at John's prologue. And this is in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Now, the purpose of John's prologue is John wants to point, because remember, John is writing to show us, to prove that Jesus is God. So John wants to point out in his prologue the pre-existence of Jesus. What does that mean? It means, what we're saying is that Jesus existed before he became human. And so in John's prologue, in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, John speaks of the pre-existence of Christ and his incarnation. In John chapter 1, verse 1, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You go right back into Genesis 1:1, the first verse in the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. This directly correlates to John's first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. And the Greek term translated into English as word is logos. Yeah. John used this term as a title or a name, and he seemed to assume that the readers would understand the significance of it, so it must have been a very familiar concept in the first century. Now we have 3 possible sources for it. The first source would be Greek philosophy. The second source are the writings of Philo or Philo or rabbinic theology regarding the concept of the memra. Now we know that the Greek term John used, translated into the English term word, is the Greek word logos. Now, this has been taught primarily one way, to the neglect of a better representation of what John is trying to teach. The first approach usually taught is explaining logos from a Greek philosophy. And in Greek philosophy, the logos had two concepts. It's used two ways. First, it's used in the concept of reason, and secondly, in the concept of speech. So in the concept of reason, it's the idea of God. In the concept of speech, it's the expression of God. Now, it's not that these two concepts are wrong, but they are incomplete. And what we see is that most commentaries try to explain what logos meant in Greek philosophy. Most commentaries try to show that Jesus came to fulfill the goals of Greek philosophy in both areas of reason and speech. What are they trying to do? Well, what they say is that by reason, Jesus was the very idea of God, and that by speech, he was the very expression of God. And most commentaries will depict it this way. But major thing here, what these commentaries forget is that by profession, John the apostle was not a Greek philosopher, he was a Jewish fisherman, right? The second possible source was Philo. He was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, he was a contemporary of both Jesus and the Apostle John, and he was well versed in Greek philosophy, and he used to interpret the Jewish scriptures employing an allegorical method, an allegorical approach. The Galilean fishermen simply did not travel in the same circles as the Alexandrian philosopher. To find the source of his logos, we actually need look no further than the Judaism that John grew up with, and that was the Judaism of the land of Israel. Now, the approach John intended was the use of the word from a Hebrew theological perspective, not Greek. In Hebrew theology, two words were possible. We have the word davar, which is the Hebrew, and we have the word memra, which is Aramaic. Now, John was very familiar with the Aramaic translation and interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, and that's what we call the Targumim. The Targumim. Now, in the Targumim, the translators used the word memra, and the Targumic usage of this term is where we find the source of John's logos. And this is found in the rabbinic Jewish writings of first century Israel, which was predominantly in Aramaic. The Hebrew equivalent we saw is davar. Now, remember, John was by profession a Hebrew fisherman, and he was thinking in thinking of the Jewish philosophy of theology and religion of his day, which was embodied in this world called memra. He was not thinking in Greek philosophy, nor was he promoting any Greek Hellenized philosophy with the concept of creation and creator that was totally incompatible with the Hebrew scriptures, and that's what Philo was teaching. Now, rather, what we see here is that when John was writing his gospel, he was using concepts of God that were being taught by the rabbis of Jesus' day. And he was adding to these concepts based on God's divine revelation. Remember, that's how the scriptures were written. The illuminating of the Holy Spirit, they wrote these scriptures. Now, do we have a theological basis for John to reference the Old Testament and not the Greek pagan background of Logos? Absolutely. There are two. First of all, the Hebrew scriptures record that the Word of God is personified, making him the second person of the Godhead. And we see this in places like Genesis 15:1 and 15:4, 1 Samuel 3:21, 2 Samuel 23:1-2, 1 Kings 19:9, and Psalm 33:6. They're the same. Now, the second point is that the Hebrew rabbis who made the Aramaic paraphrases, which was a Targumim, used the term Memra as the creator and covenant-making God, equal with the Father, yet distinct from the Father. John was writing this in Greek, and logos is the only word he could use. Logos does not express the concepts and teachings behind Memra. There was one other related word which John did not use, and that was the Greek word rhema. Now, rhema refers to the spoken word. Logos refers to the written and or the spoken word. Now, the basis behind the word Memra, the rabbis came to 6 theological teachings on the word Memra, which John could only translate into Greek by the word logos. So the rabbis taught 6 basic truths about Memra, and we see this in the first 18 verses of John's gospel. First of all, in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. The Memra, the Word, was distinct from God, but also was the same as God. Now, in all their writings, the rabbis never made an attempt to explain the difference. How is it possible to be distinct from God and the same as God at the same time? They taught both statements as being true, and they left it there. John does the same thing in verse 1. And like the rabbis, John does not try to explain it at this point either. He does expand on it later in his writings in the area of the Trinity, in that what he's saying, what he's writing about is distinct from God in that he's not God the Father and he's not God the Holy Spirit, yet he is the same as God in that he is the second person of the Godhead, the Son. He's God the Son. And so only in terms of this triunity can this paradox be explained. Now, second thing, the Memra, the Word, was the agent of creation. This is in John chapter 1, verse 3. Whenever God created anything, he did so by means of his Memra, by means of his Word. And so everything that exists because of his Word, because of his Memra. Without his Memra, nothing would exist that now exists. And this is derived from passages such as Genesis 1, where God simply spoke the word, let there be, 3 words in English, but only 1 in Hebrew. Wherever he spoke the word, let there be, it would simply come into existence. And so the Memra is the agent of creation. And verse 3 of John chapter 1, verse 3, it says, all things were made by or through him, and without him was not anything made that hath been made. He's talking about Jesus here. In verse 3, John says the same thing happened to be true about his Logos. Everything was made through him. So his Logos is the agent of creation, the Memra. You can also pick this up in Hebrews 11, 1 to 3. Third thing, the Memra, the Word, was the agent of salvation. And we see this in John chapter 1, verse 12. Now, throughout Old Testament history, wherever God saved, it was always by means of his Memra, by means of his Word. Now, it might be a physical salvation, such as the Exodus out of Egypt, or it might be a spiritual salvation. So whether God saved physically or spiritually, it was always by means of his Memra, by means of his Word. And if we look at verse 12 of John 1, it says, as many as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God, even to them that believe on his name. So in verse 12, John says that this one is the agent of salvation because it is those who believe on this one, this one who was the Word, those who receive this one, they are the ones who receive their salvation from him who is the agent of salvation. How cool is that? Now, fourth thing is the word or the memra was the means by which God becomes visible. And we see this in John chapter 1, verse 14. Now and then in the Old Testament, what we see is God took on some kind of a visible form. When he did so, it was by means of his memra, by means of his word. And in Christian theology, we call these a theophany. In Hebrew theology, or the rabbinic term was the Shekinah, and it was usually connected with the glory of God, the visible manifestation. So it's frequently coupled together, Shekinah, glory of God. What's the Shekinah glory of God? Well, the Shekinah glory of God in its simplest form. It's the visible manifestation of God's presence. So whenever the invisible God became visible, whenever the omnipotent God became somehow localized, this visible localized presence was the Shekinah glory. Now, throughout much of the Old Testament history, the Shekinah, the glory of God came either as light or a fire or a cloud. And now these were not the only manifestations, but these were the primary ones. Sometimes it was the angel of Jehovah. So we have light, fire, cloud, or some combination of these three things. But whenever it came, it always came by means of the memra, by means of the word. And then again, the means by which God became visible was by means of the Shekinah glory, by means of the memra, by means of the word. Now, and in verse 14, it says, and the word became flesh. So the word, the logos, that back in verse 1 was in the beginning with God, who was God, invisible God. Now at a certain point in human history, he now takes on visible form, but this time what became visible was not an intangible light, fire, or cloud, but this time it becomes very tangible flesh. He became human. He became a man, flesh and bone. And then John continues, it says he dwelt among us. Now, it's not to dwell, but it is to tabernacle. And John the Apostle did not use the normal Greek word for to dwell, but the term skene, which literally means to tabernacle. So the Hebrew Shekinah and the Greek skene are very closely related. And the origin of the word Shekinah goes back to Exodus chapter 40, verse 34, where it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So where the Shekinah glory in the form of a cloud took up residency within the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. And a Hebrew word here for tabernacle is the word called Mishkan, and it comes from the same Hebrew root word for Shekinah. How cool is that? So it took up residency in the Holy of Holies of the Mishkan, the Shekinah. The Shekinah took up a residence in the Holy of Holies of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And what we see is that for the next several centuries, it tabernacled among the people of Israel until the Shekinah glory departed from Israel in the days of Ezekiel. And we see that in Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11, where the Shekinah glory departed in 4 stages. Now, Shekinah glory was absent for about 600 years. And now, in John's day, it appears not in a cloud, not by fire, not by light, but it now appears in human flesh, in the person of Jesus Christ. And John now ties it very quickly, like the rabbis, into verse 14, when he says, and the word became flesh and dwelt, or tabernacled, among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus's flesh acted as a veil to hide the glory of God. So when people looked at him, he looked no different from any other Jewish male of the first century. But in that one instance on the Mount of Transfiguration, when he briefly allowed his glory to shine through, it penetrated his veil, his flesh, and there we see his face begin to shine with the brightness of the sun. So 3 of the disciples, they saw him and the brightness of his glory on that occasion. And John writes as an eyewitness in verse 14, and we beheld his glory. That's what he's writing about, the transfiguration. So Jesus became the visible manifestation of God's presence. And just as in rabbinic theology in the past, where we see the memra take on the form of a cloud or fire or light, now we see the memra, the word, take on the form of flesh in Jesus Christ. He is a visible manifestation of God's presence. So rabbis taught 6 truths about the memra. The memra was the means by which God signed his covenants. In the Old Testament, God made 8 covenants with mankind, 3 with humanity, Adamic and Noahic, and 5 to Israel, specifically the Abrahamic, Mosaic, land or Palestinian, Davidic, and the New Covenant. Now, all of them were signed and sealed by means of his memra, or by means of his word. And so the memra is the means by which God signs his covenants. 5th point does not come out quite as obvious as the other 5. In verse 17, he hints at it. He says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ." So to tie it here, what we're saying is that the age or the dispensation of the law, Mosaic law, was based on the Mosaic covenant, which was signed and sealed by the Shekinah glory in Exodus 24, 1-18. Abrahamic covenant was also signed by the Shekinah in Exodus 15, 1-18. Remember, the fire went down the split animals. But this new age of grace now is based on the new covenant, which we find in Jeremiah 31, 31-34. And we also see it in Hebrews chapters 8-10. Now, which he'll now sign and seal, how? On the cross with the shedding of his blood. So what Jesus did on the cross, among his many accomplishments, was the signing and the sealing of the new covenant. So on that basis, he is a covenant signer. He is the memra, the living word. Now, the word or memra was the agent of revelation. In verse 18, wherever God revealed himself, he did so by means of the memra or the word. Whatever we know about God, we know because the memra, the word, Jesus, chose to reveal him to us. And this was based upon so many passages which said the word of the Lord came to this prophet or to that prophet. And if we cast our mind back to the Jewish scriptures, we see there it says, and the word of the Lord came to Moses, or in the prophets, the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Ezekiel. It's always the Lord said or the Lord commanded. So the memra, the logos, the memra, is that agent whereby God reveals himself. No man has seen God at any time. This is verse 18. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. So here we have Jesus, the memra. He is the agent of revelation. Now, one of John's 2 sub-themes is this one, where the Son came to reveal the Father to men. And so John, he will spend more time with the teaching of Jesus, where he reveals the nature of the Father. Because of that sub-theme, John is the only one who records the words of Philip, one of the Lord's disciples, in John 14, verse 8. Now, what did Philip say? He said, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Everything true of the divine nature of the Father is true of the divine nature of the Son. And to know the Son is to know the Father. And, if you have a look at Hebrews 11, 1-3, it speaks about God. We're running a bit behind time, but I'll give it to you anyway. It says, God having of old time spoken unto the fathers in the prophets by diverse portions and in diverse manners, have at the end of these days spoken unto us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the effulgence or the radiance of his glory and the very image of his substance, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had made purification of sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty and high. So what's he saying? In the past, God had revealed himself in many different ways, but in these last days, he revealed himself by means of his Son, the Logos, who is the agent of revelation. And what did John say? 4 points. So John's point in these 18 verses is not that Jesus came to fulfill goals of Greek philosophy of Logos, but rather Jesus came to fulfill the Jewish messianic hope. And so the 6 things that the rabbis have been teaching about the Memra are also true of Jesus. And with all this in mind, the first verses of John's gospel, we can summarize them in 4 points, 4 simple points. First of all, the Word, the Davar, the Memra, the Logos, came in visible form. Second, sadly, the world in general failed to recognize him. Third, even more tragically, his own Jewish people failed to recognize him as well. Fourth, those individual Jews and Gentiles who did recognize him are the ones who became the children of the Shekinah light, and they received their salvation from him who is the agent of salvation. There are a couple other things here. I'll deal with these next week. Okay. There are contact details there. If you'd like to contact us for any reason, you can find them there.